It started with a government form. Not a love letter, not a fight, not some affair revealed in lipstick-stained shirts or cryptic texts. No, it was a form, cold, bureaucratic, unfeeling. Mark and I were planning a long-delayed trip to Portugal. He'd been invited to a real estate conference and I decided to tag along. We hadn't traveled together in years. Maybe this was our way of reclaiming something that had dulled over time. I was in the study sorting through our files, passport copies, tax returns, birth certificates, when I realized we didn't have a copy of our marriage certificate. We'd married in 2003 in a tiny garden ceremony outside Asheville. It had been simple, beautiful. He'd cried during the vows. I wore a linen dress barefoot in the grass, so where was the proof? I found my birth certificate, his, even the deed to the house, but no marriage certificate. I asked him casually that night over dinner, "Honey, do you remember where we filed our marriage paperwork? I can't find a copy." He blinked over his glass of wine. "Huh, that's strange. Didn't we file it right after the ceremony? I assumed you did. You had the folder, remember?" He paused. "I'm sure it's somewhere. Maybe the courthouse has a copy." There was a flicker in his eyes. Just a second too long. That's when the humming started in my ears. Not suspicion, not yet. Just the sound of something unsettling beginning to move. The next morning, I called the county clerk's office, gave them our full names, the date, the location. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry, ma'am. There's no marriage license on file." I almost laughed. There must be some mistake. She checked again, asked me to spell it all out, checked alternate spellings. Still nothing. "Maybe you filed it in another county," she suggested. Maybe, or maybe not. I confronted him again that night, this time with the weight of absence in my voice. "There's no record, Mark." He looked annoyed. "Of course there is. They probably lost it. You know how government offices are. It's been 20 years. He shrugged. "It's just a piece of paper." A piece of paper. I sat back in my chair, stared at him, and for the first time in a long time, I noticed how practiced his face was. Not calm, controlled. Like someone used to lying just beneath the surface. My hands were trembling beneath the table. "I want to know if you ever filed it," I said. He didn't answer right away. "Mark," he sighed. "Look, I didn't think it mattered. It was a formality. We were married in every way that counts, except the one that makes it real." "That's not fair," he snapped. I stood. "You're right. It isn't." Because none of this was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the wedding in my mind. The flowers, the laughter, the way he held my hands. Had it all been a performance? The next morning, I called my sister Mara. She lived 3 states away, and had always been the sharper of the two of us, more cynical, less romantic. She didn't sound surprised. "I warned you back then," she said. "You were too eager to believe he was the real thing." I hated hearing it, but she wasn't wrong. Mara remembered Mark being evasive about his past, secretive about money, vague when it came to legal details. "You didn't want to see it, Evie," she said gently. "I felt like a fool, a wife without a marriage." I decided to go in person to the clerk's office just to be sure. Maybe there was a misfile. Maybe some computer record hadn't transferred over. The woman behind the counter was kind but firm. She searched everything, even called over a supervisor, but after 20 minutes she shook her head. "There's no record of a license, an application, or a filing," she said. "You were never registered as legally married in this county." I thanked her and walked to my car like I was moving through water. In my hands, nothing. In my chest, the crumbling of 20 years. I drove home slowly, unsure if I wanted to walk back into the same house, eat at the same table, sleep in the same bed, with a man who now felt like a ghost of convenience. I didn't tell him where I'd gone. He didn't ask. Instead, he handed me a coffee and kissed my cheek. And I flinched, because now I saw it how easy it was for him to fake intimacy, to pretend we were still husband and wife even if the state had never once acknowledged it. And that's when it began, the undoing. I looked at the man I'd built a life with, and realized I didn't know him at all. I didn't tell anyone else. Not yet. I didn't want pity. I didn't want Mara's voice in my head reminding me again that she'd always had her doubts. I didn't want my friends at book club tilting their heads in sympathy, saying things like, "Men are complicated," or "You're so strong, Evelyn." I wasn't strong. I was hollow. And I was standing in the middle of a house I had helped pay for, built a life in, painted and repainted, and suddenly unsure if any of it legally or emotionally even belonged to me. I tried to convince myself it was a mistake. Maybe we'd filed the paperwork late. Maybe it ended up in a drawer or a bin and never got processed. Maybe Mark was right, it was just a piece of paper. Maybe I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he had known. For a long time. That night, while he was in the shower, I opened the locked file drawer in the study. The key was taped inside the desk drawer, same place it had always been. I expected to find our marriage certificate. Instead, I found carefully labeled folders, taxes, home repairs, investment property deeds, even a folder labeled prenup, not used, but no marriage certificate, and no mention of me in any ownership document. Not on the house, not on the rental property we managed, not on the car that sat in our driveway. Everything was in his name. I sat there staring at the inked proof of my invisibility. We'd been partners, or so I thought, but on paper I didn't exist. I confronted him the next morning with a calm I didn't feel. I looked through the files last night. He didn't blink. Why? Because I needed answers. He sat down across from me at the kitchen island. "And what answers are you looking for exactly?" "I need to know the truth, Mark. Why didn't you ever file our marriage license?" He exhaled like I was exhausting him. "Evelyn, it's not some grand conspiracy. We got married. We lived as husband and wife. The paperwork just slipped through the cracks." "Slipped through the cracks," I repeated. "For 20 years. His jaw tightened. "Do you want to make this a fight?" "No," I said. "I want to understand if you ever intended to make it real." That hit him. He looked away, then said, "You know I love you." "That's not what I asked." Silence stretched between us like a pulled thread. "I was going through a rough patch back then," he said finally. "I wasn't sure what I believed. I didn't want to be tied down in a way that could ruin me financially if it didn't work out." I stared at him. "So you let me think we were married all these years, just in case." He didn't answer, and that told me everything. I didn't cry, not then. I made myself coffee, sat on the back porch, watched a pair of doves land on the power line, and I realized something brutal. He had loved me but never trusted me. He had lived with me but never committed to me. He had kissed me but kept his future fenced off behind legal technicalities I didn't even know existed. The version of marriage I had believed in had never been real. Not to him. I called Mara again. This time I told her everything. She didn't say "I told you so." She just listened. Then she asked one question. "Do you want to fight for it or walk away?" I didn't know the answer yet. All I knew was I needed the truth. Not just about the paperwork, but about the man I had built my life beside. Because it's one thing to be betrayed by a stranger. It's another to sleep beside that betrayal every night thinking it loved you. It was late, nearly midnight, when I found myself back in the garage digging through a bin labeled keepsakes. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were our wedding photos. Me barefoot in a linen dress laughing under the fairy lights. Mark teary-eyed holding my hands like they were the only thing keeping him grounded. I had believed in that moment. In him. But belief doesn't make something binding. I flipped through the photos slowly. The program. The guest book. Even a dried flower from my bouquet. But no copy of the license, no signed document, nothing legal, nothing binding. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the bin open beside me, and asked myself the question I hadn't dared to ask. Had I ever really been his wife? Not in spirit, not in love, but in the eyes of the world. And if I hadn't, what did that make me? The next morning, I called the wedding officiant, Reverend Thompson. He was retired now, living out of state, but he remembered me instantly. "Oh, Evelyn, my goodness, Has it really been 20 years? I kept my voice steady. Do you remember if you filed our marriage license? I believe I gave it to Mark after the ceremony. That was the arrangement. He said he'd handle it. Is there a problem? No, no problem, I lied, just confirming. But my hands were shaking when I hung up. Mark had taken the document. He never filed it. Not accidentally, intentionally. And I knew with the painful certainty of hindsight that he had made that decision with a clear mind and a steady hand. He had never planned for permanence, only for the illusion of it. I spent the next few days walking through the house like a guest in someone else's story. Everything began to look different. The framed wedding photo in the hallway crooked, dusty. The anniversary clock on the mantel frozen at the wrong time. The empty space on the shelf where our joint insurance policy should have been. And the worst part, I started to question myself. Had I pushed too hard for the wedding? Had I ignored red flags? Had I chosen a man who treated love like a lease? Mark noticed my silence. Evie, he said one night, you've been distant. I didn't answer. Look, I know I should have handled the paperwork differently, but it's not like I don't love you. Love. That word again. So easy to say, so hard to prove. What does love mean to you? I asked. He looked startled. What kind of question is that? A real one. He frowned. It means we built a life together. It means I've been here. Every day. Being here isn't the same as committing to being here, I said. You built a world where I was always optional. That's not true. Then why did you make sure from the very beginning that I had no legal claim to anything? He didn't answer. Because he couldn't. Because I wasn't wrong. That night, I started writing everything down. A timeline, notes, scans of bank statements, emails, receipts. It felt insane gathering proof of a life that was supposed to be built on trust. But I needed something tangible. I needed to remind myself that I hadn't imagined it. That the birthdays, the arguments, the vacations, the quiet nights on the porch, they had all happened. Even if they weren't legally bound. I had lived them, even if he had only performed them. The next morning, I opened my laptop and started researching. Legal rights for unmarried long-term partners. Property laws in our state. What constitutes common law marriage and what doesn't. The results were chilling. I had no automatic rights, no share in his estate, no legal protection. If he died tomorrow, I wouldn't even be listed as next of kin. 20 years. And legally, I was a roommate. I printed everything and put it in a new binder labeled Reality. It sat beside our old photo album on the shelf. Side by side, truth and memory. A marriage that never existed and the life I had poured into it. And as I looked at the two books, I asked myself one question. Which one was more real? The one with documents, or the one with love? And the answer for now was I wasn't sure, but I was going to find out. Even if it meant tearing the illusion apart to see what was left underneath. Mara had warned me, not in a dramatic you'll regret this kind of way. No, Mara was too practical for that. She dropped her opinions like stones into a still pond, knowing the ripples would reach me eventually. I remember the day I told her Mark and I were getting married. We were sitting on the porch swing at our parents' old house drinking sweet tea, while cicadas screamed in the background. I was glowing. Buzzing. A little drunk on the kind of hope that comes before you realize how heavy forever can be. She looked at me over the rim of her glass and said, Are you sure he's the kind of man who'd build a life with you, or just borrow yours for a while? I laughed. What does that even mean? She didn't laugh back. You love him. That much is clear. But does he claim you, Evelyn, in front of the world? With action, not just words. I got defensive. I always did when Mara poked at my dreams. He's not a show-off, I'd said. He's private. Careful. Not everyone needs to parade their love around. She didn't argue. She just sipped her tea and said, Just promise me you'll ask the right questions before you hand over your whole life. I never did. Because I thought love was the answer to everything. But love without foundation is just wind with a warm smile. I called her again after I finished cataloging the files, all the evidence of Mark's life, his assets, his property, his carefully curated independence, and none of it with my name on it. He planned this, I said softly. Mara didn't ask. Are you sure? She said. What are you gonna do? I don't know. You want me to come out there? I nearly cried. No, not yet. I need to figure this out myself. There was a pause. Okay. But you're not alone in this. You never were. Even if he made you feel that way. I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed. She was right. He had made me feel that way subtly over time with 1,000 paper cuts of disregard that I'd mistaken for normalcy. He had trained me to expect less, to be grateful for crumbs, to call his distance respect and his silence peace. But now I could see it. He'd built an entire life beside me, not with me. And suddenly, I didn't want to be beside him anymore. The shift happened quietly. I stopped making his coffee in the morning. I started locking my office door when I worked. I took off my wedding ring. It wasn't rebellion, it was reclamation. The end of pretending. He noticed, of course, but he didn't say anything. Because if he acknowledged the change, he'd have to admit what caused it. And Mark wasn't the type to confess unless cornered. 3 days later, he knocked on my study door. Going somewhere, he asked, eyeing my packed tote bag by the couch. I'm taking a few days at the cottage. Our family had a small lakeside cabin 2 hours away. I hadn't visited in years. I could come with... No, I said quickly. I need time alone. He looked like he wanted to argue. But then something flickered behind his eyes' relief. That stung more than I expected. Okay, he said. Let me know if you need anything. I nodded and turned back to my laptop. He lingered a moment longer. But still he didn't apologize. Still he didn't try. He just let me go. At the cottage, I breathed for the first time in weeks. The silence was different here. It didn't feel like neglect. It felt like a clean slate. I sat on the deck, watched the water ripple against the rocks, and wrote in my journal for hours. For the first time, I asked myself a terrifying question. If I hadn't found out, would I have ever left? And the answer that bloomed inside me was worse than I expected. No, I would have stayed. I would have kept orbiting a man who had never truly made room for me in his life. Because I loved the story more than the truth. Because I thought loyalty meant endurance. Because I didn't want to admit that maybe, just maybe, I had loved a man who saw me as convenient but disposable. I called Mara again that night. She didn't say much, just listened. At the end of the call, she said something that stuck with me. You were never stupid, Evelyn. You were hopeful. That's not a weakness. It's just dangerous when misplaced. Hope. Yes, I'd built my marriage on hope, but now it was time to build something else. Something real. Something mine. The clerk behind the counter wore readers at the tip of her nose and a soft gray cardigan with pearl buttons. Her name tag read, Carol. She looked like someone's grandmother, warm, approachable, maybe a little too used to seeing heartbreak walk through the door. I stood in front of her in the cool, over-air-conditioned hall of the records division, holding my folded appointment confirmation and a sinking feeling I already knew the answer to. I'm here to verify marriage records for Mark Grayson and Evelyn Hart, I said. She typed slowly. The kind of deliberate typing that makes your chest clench before anything's said aloud. Date of marriage, she asked. September 14, 2003. More typing. The clack of keys echoed across the polished floor like tiny gavel strikes. She looked up at me with a wrinkle between her brows. I don't see a license filed under either of those names. I nodded, but it wasn't understanding. I was just trying to hold myself together. Could it have been misfiled or sent to the wrong county? I asked, my voice thinner than usual. Carol gave a patient, practiced smile. It's possible. But I can check under alternate spellings or surrounding counties if you'd like. I gave her every possible spelling, every variation, even the middle initials. She tried them all. Nothing. No application, she said finally. No license. No certificate. If it was ever submitted, it never made it into the system. She paused, then added gently, but from the record here, you were never legally married in the state of North Carolina. It didn't hurt the way I expected. It felt numb, like I had been standing at the edge of a cliff suspecting the drop, and now I'd seen the bottom. Carol watched me carefully the way someone does when they're used to seeing people fall apart in government offices. Would you like to file a delayed marriage certificate? She offered. I shook my head. No, because I wasn't here to fix a mistake. I was here to accept the truth. Outside, the late morning sun felt dishonest, too warm, too bright. I sat on the curb outside the building, not caring if I looked lost. A woman in a suit walked past me, laughing into her phone. Two men argued about parking meters at the corner. The world spun on. And I was sitting there trying to figure out how a woman can give her whole life to a man and still be a legal stranger. Back home, Mark was making sandwiches in the kitchen, humming to himself like it was any other day. I set my bag down. He looked up. Hey, you were gone early. Everything okay? I stared at him. 20 years of mornings, 20 years of inside jokes, quiet routines, shared bills, vacations, anniversaries. 20 years of being invisible on paper. No, Mark, I said quietly. Everything's not okay. He wiped his hands on a dish towel. What's wrong? I went to the records office today. That stopped him. And there's no record of us. No license, no certificate, no application. He swallowed. I told you I thought I filed it. It must have. Stop, I said. Just stop. He froze the way men do when they realize the performance is over. I talked to Reverend Thompson, I continued. You took the license. You said you'd file it. He opened his mouth to speak. I held up my hand. I'm not interested in hearing why you didn't. I'm not looking for an apology. I just want you to hear this, Mark. I know now. I see it clearly. He looked at me finally like I was something unfamiliar. Someone he couldn't charm his way past. Evie, he said. I love you. I've always loved you. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. And yet I said you made sure I could be erased with a single form. That night, I stayed in the guest room. He didn't come looking for me. He didn't knock. And for the first time in years, I slept better than I expected. Because even though I didn't know what I'd do next, at least I wasn't pretending anymore. At least I wasn't loving someone who had left a legal back door wide open for 20 years. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not because I was filing anything. Not yet. But I needed to know what protections I had. I needed to know what pieces of my life I could salvage. Because if I wasn't a wife, then I needed to learn how to be something else. A woman who could walk away with her head high and her power intact. There's something cruel about learning your love story was built on a technicality. Mark and I weren't a whirlwind romance. We were a slow burn. We dated for a year, lived together for another, then married in what I believed was a quiet but committed step into permanence. We didn't do prenups, joint bank accounts, or power of attorney documents because we trusted each other. Or rather, I trusted him. He trusted that I'd never question him. And for 20 years, I didn't. My first meeting with the lawyer, Clara, was both eye-opening and humiliating. She was kind, professional, and younger than me by at least a decade. Still, she never once looked down on me, even when I told her the truth. I believed we were married. I had no reason to doubt. And I just found out we weren't. She nodded, not blinking. Unfortunately, this is more common than you might think. I blinked. Really? Mostly with men who are either protecting assets or maintaining some kind of secondary life. But yes, it happens. That word, protecting assets. It came up again and again. Do you know what assets he holds? She asked. Some, I said. But he's always been private with money. Even when things were tight, he wouldn't let me look at the books. Just said he had it handled. She wrote something down. In this state, there is no common law marriage, which means technically you have no spousal rights. I nodded. I had expected that part. What about the house? I asked. Is your name on the deed? No. Then legally it's his. The words landed like dull knives. One by one, pieces of my life were being stripped away. The home I redecorated 10 times over. The back porch I had painted with my own hands. The rental cabin we co-managed. Even the SUV I drove to work, his name, his loan, his control. Do I have any leverage? I asked. She leaned back in her chair. You have 20 years of shared history, shared expenses, and possibly verbal agreements that a judge might consider if we position it as a civil partnership or as a fraud case, but it's not straightforward. And emotionally, she met my gaze. Emotionally, you've been his wife. In every way but on paper. I sat with that. Emotion doesn't hold up in court, but it can still break you. That night, I asked Mark the one question I hadn't yet voiced. Did you ever intend to file the marriage certificate? He didn't answer right away. He poured himself a drink, sat down across from me, that same composed, measured expression he wore whenever the conversation veered too close to honesty. No, he said finally, I didn't. The air drained from the room. I loved you, he added quickly. I still do. But I needed security. I'd seen too many divorces ruin men friends of mine. Everything they worked for gone. I stared at him. And you thought I would do that to you. It wasn't personal, he said, as if that excused everything. I devoted my entire adult life to you. I didn't want to lose the business. Or the house. Or, you didn't want to lose your freedom, I cut in. He didn't deny it. That was the moment the last thread snapped. It wasn't about paperwork. It wasn't even about legality anymore. It was about value. He had loved me, yes, but not enough to tie his fate to mine. Not enough to risk being truly equal. Not enough to make us real. I packed a bag that night. Not forever, not yet, but enough to feel like I had space to breathe. He didn't stop me. He didn't cry. He didn't chase. Just stood there in the doorway, arms folded, watching me like I was something he used to own, but no longer understood. You're making a mistake, he said. I looked at him one last time. No, Mark, you made it, 20 years ago. I drove to the cottage again, but this time I didn't cry on the deck. I didn't write in my journal. I sat in silence, let the water reflect back the truth I had spent too long denying. He had loved me, yes, but he had also calculated me. He had made sure I could be erased if things went south. He had stayed because it was comfortable. And now he was shocked I'd finally realized I was disposable. In the morning, I emailed Clara. I want to move forward, I wrote. I don't know if I want revenge, but I want clarity. I want accountability. And I want my story on record even if the law refuses to call it a marriage. Because if I couldn't be a wife in the eyes of the law, then I would be a woman who told the truth louder than his silence ever could. My life now reclassified as a lie. I used to keep every receipt, every card, every note from Mark that ever made me feel seen. Even the ones scribbled on napkins. Don't forget the eggs followed by a crooked heart. I once believed love lived in those small gestures, that it was in the margins of daily life where devotion was proven. Now I couldn't look at any of it without questioning its authenticity. What was real? What was performance? What was convenience mistaken for care? And the worst thought of all, what if I had filled in the gaps for him, projecting loyalty and love where he offered only habit and proximity? I stood in our kitchen, my kitchen the one I painted pale blue and filled with the smell of cinnamon and rosemary for over 2 decades, and realized I didn't know whose life I had actually been living, because it wasn't mine. Not legally, not emotionally, not anymore. I spent the next few days dismantling everything in quiet revolt. I pulled my name off our holiday card list. I updated my driver's license back to my maiden name, just Evelyn Hart, not Evelyn Grayson. The DMV clerk raised an eyebrow when I asked to make the change. Divorce, she asked casually. I smiled bitterly. Something like that. I also took down the wedding portrait in the hallway. I didn't throw it away, not yet. I just couldn't stand the sight of it smiling down on me like a lie caught in a frame. At night, I lay awake imagining a courtroom where I'd stand and tell a judge, Your Honor, I was married in spirit but ghosted on paper. I wondered how many women could tell the same story. Too many, I suspected. Mara came to visit. She brought with her a bottle of wine, a weekend bag, and the exact level of judgment-free companionship I needed. She walked in, set the wine on the table, and said, You look 5 pounds lighter, because I stopped carrying his version of me. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then she said, You do realize this isn't your shame to carry, right? I know that. But knowing it and feeling it are 2 different things. Then let's start with what you do know. I sat down across from her and whispered that I don't want to go back. Good, that's a beginning. We drank that night and cried a little, but mostly we laughed. Mara reminded me who I was before Mark, before compromise became my native tongue, before I learned to say, it's fine, so fluently I started to believe it. Hey. The legal process was slower than I expected. Because technically there was no divorce to file. Instead, Clara helped me file for partition and reimbursement a civil lawsuit aimed at recovering assets tied to shared contributions. We were making a case that even without a marriage certificate, I had invested time, labor, and money into a life that now legally excluded me. We had to prove domestic partnership contribution to property maintenance and evidence of financial entanglement. I sent Clara everything receipts for home improvements, emails discussing mortgage payments, bank transfers, co-signed bills, vacation bookings, and even messages from Mark thanking me for keeping our home together. Everything became evidence. Our love story was now an exhibit. It felt like death by paperwork. Mark tried calling at first, then texting, then emailing. Each message got colder, more rehearsed. The first one, I never meant to hurt you. This is all a misunderstanding. The next, you're overreacting. Don't throw away what we built. By the third, if you go public with this, you'll regret it. I can make this very difficult for you. I didn't respond. But I saved everything. Clara added the threats to the case file. His mask was cracking. Friends started asking questions. Some had heard from him. Others had simply noticed I wasn't wearing my ring or posting anniversary photos like I usually did. I didn't give details. But when they looked at me with those wide, sympathetic eyes, I just said, "We weren't what we said we were." Some nodded in understanding. Others gasped. A few, the ones who clung tightly to the fantasy of marriage as a safe bet, looked away. I didn't blame them. Shattering illusions makes people uncomfortable. One night, I came across an old email from Mark dated 3 years into our marriage. The subject line was, "For the future." Inside was a spreadsheet of our savings goals, vacation ideas, and home renovation plans. At the bottom, he'd written, "We're a good team, Evie. Here's to the next 20. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just pressed archive. Because it was never about the absence of feeling. It was about the deliberate avoidance of commitment, about power, about keeping doors unlocked in case he ever wanted to walk away without leaving a trace. And I had finally locked the door behind him. The cottage became my refuge. Mara and I repainted the living room. I put up new curtains, bought myself a secondhand desk, and started taking more freelance editing work. I was rebuilding not just physically but philosophically. For the first time, I wasn't someone's partner. I was my own, and it felt like breathing again after years of suffocating in silk gloves. The court hearing was set for 6 weeks out. Mark filed a motion to dismiss, of course, claimed there was no legal basis for restitution, that we had no binding agreements, that I was simply a guest in his home. When Clara showed me the paperwork, I laughed. But it wasn't joy. It was recognition. Mark had always seen himself as the architect, and me, just the decorator. But I wasn't decorating anymore. I was demolishing, and from the rubble I would build something real. No illusions, no silence, no waiting for love to validate my worth. Because it turns out the life I thought I shared was never mine to begin with. But now it would be. The courtroom, where I named the lie. It was a strange thing walking into a courtroom not to end a marriage but to prove one had ever existed at all. The hall was chilled with recycled air and the kind of tension you can't quite name, the kind that sits on your collarbones and makes your breaths shallow. I wore navy. No jewelry. A scarf Mara had given me not for fashion but for comfort. Like armor stitched with quiet hands. Mark stood across the room in a dark suit flanked by his lawyer posture, stiff expression unreadable. For 20 years we'd sat side by side at every parent-teacher conference, doctor's appointment, dinner table, and family reunion. Now we were opposing parties. Not because I wanted to be his enemy, but because I had finally refused to be invisible. The judge was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, calm, precise, the kind of person who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. Clara opened our case with confidence. Your Honor, this is a civil complaint for restitution and equitable division of shared assets based on a 20-year domestic partnership built on mutual contribution despite the absence of a legally filed marriage certificate. Mark's lawyer countered quickly, calling the relationship cohabitation with independent finances and accusing me not maliciously, but with that patronizing lilt lawyers use of misinterpreting the nature of the arrangement. I was not Mark's wife, they argued. I was a long-term companion who benefited from the defendant's generosity. I clenched my jaw. Clara looked at me. Her eyes said, "Let them underestimate you." Then came my testimony. I took the stand, swore the oath, and sat straight. Clara walked me through the years, our wedding, the house, the joint decisions, the shared bank cards, the home office I built while he started his business, the vacations I booked, the taxes I helped prepare, the meals, the mortgage, the plans. It felt like excavating a ghost. I believed I was married, I said. I was introduced as his wife, included as his wife, relied upon as his wife. I just wasn't protected as one. Mark didn't look at me, but I saw his foot tapping under the table. Then Clara asked the question I hadn't prepared for. When did you realize it wasn't real? There was a long silence. I thought about the moment in the records office. Carol's soft eyes. The absence of my name. But that wasn't it. The first time I truly knew I said voice steady was when I confronted him and he wasn't surprised. He didn't panic. He didn't say, "It's a mistake, let's fix it." He just shrugged. Like it had always been this way. Because it had. The judge blinked slowly. "Thank you, Ms. Hart." And just like that, I stepped down from the stand, a little taller than I'd ever stood in that man's shadow. Mark took the stand next, and I saw for the first time the carefully curated version of himself start to crack. He spoke smoothly at first of our understanding of how we agreed not to complicate things with legalities. He made it sound mature, pragmatic, adult. But Clara's questions were a scalpel. Did she ever ask about the marriage license? Yes, years ago. And what did you say? That I filed it. But you hadn't. No. So you lied. A pause. Yes. No spin. No deflection. Just that single syllable that echoed like a dropped stone in a quiet room. The judge's expression didn't change, but I saw the shift. Because the moment you admit deception, no matter how polite your tone, you confirm whose version holds weight. The hearing wrapped by late afternoon. There was no dramatic ruling. That would come later in a written decision. But as I walked out of the courthouse, sun slanting through the tall windows, I realized something quietly enormous. I didn't care how the judge ruled. Don't get me wrong, I wanted justice. I wanted fairness. But I no longer needed a courtroom to confirm what I already knew. I had been a wife in every way but legal. And I had been betrayed in every way that mattered. And now, I had named the lie. Out loud. On record. Mara took me out to dinner that night. We ordered champagne even though there was no verdict yet. She said to clarity, the most underrated form of closure. I clinked my glass against hers. And to not settling for people who keep escape hatches in their hearts. We laughed. It felt good to laugh. It felt earned. Mark tried to call again a week later, left a voicemail this time. I never meant to hurt you, he said. You meant everything to me, Evelyn. I just thought I needed to protect myself. That word again. Protect. From what? From me. From love. From the commitment he pretended to live inside, but never actually signed his name to. I didn't call back. Because now I was the one protecting myself. From him. From the version of me I used to be so hungry to be chosen I mistook crumbs for devotion. Clara called with the ruling 2 weeks later. We'd won partial restitution. The judge acknowledged a pattern of long-term contribution reliance and misrepresentation. I'd receive a percentage of the house's value, a portion of Mark's retirement account, and reimbursement for shared home improvement investments. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Enough to start over. Enough to say on paper as well as in spirit I mattered. I existed, and I would not be erased. I took the check, closed our joint chapter, and bought myself a little one-bedroom cottage 20 minutes from the lake. White siding, a porch swing, a garden I planted myself. I kept the scarf Mara gave me, the journal I filled during those sleepless nights, the binder with my court documents, not because I needed to hold on to the pain, but because it reminded me how far I'd come. From ghost, to witness, to woman with a name that no longer needed a man's to mean something. My ring was just a prop. The ring had always been too tight. Mark said it was because my fingers swelled in the heat. He promised we'd get it resized after the honeymoon, then after the move, then after the business launched, then after the next thing, and the next. It never got resized. Just like our marriage never got registered. For 20 years I wore that narrow band of gold like it meant something. Like it tethered me to a future. Like it said to the world, I am chosen. I am protected. I am somebody's person. Now I saw it for what it was, a prop in a play I hadn't realized I'd been cast in. A symbol of a promise that was never legally or even emotionally fulfilled. So I took it off. Not in anger, in mourning. I remember the first time he slid it onto my finger. It was just us in the backyard, string lights swaying champagne too warm, and music playing softly from a speaker. We'd already had our ceremony earlier that day, surrounded by friends and family, vows exchanged under a canopy of roses. But this was our moment alone. Forever, he said, and I believed him. Funny how a single word can become a curse when it's rooted in fiction. Because what is forever when it's never written down, when it can vanish with a shrug and a signature Mark never gave? I hadn't just worn the ring, I'd built a life around it. And now it felt like a handcuff I'd unlocked all by myself. After the courtroom ruling, I brought the ring to a jeweler. Not to sell it, not yet, but to appraise it. I was curious, I think. Curious what it was worth now that it was stripped of its meaning. The young man behind the counter examined it under a loupe. Nice piece, he said. Modest but real gold. The diamonds small but clean. Sentimental value. I smiled tightly. Not anymore. He nodded, clearly used to that kind of answer. It would fetch about $700. 20 years, $700. That's what remained. I put the ring in a velvet pouch and tucked it away in a drawer I didn't open often. Maybe I'd sell it someday. Maybe I'd melt it down. Maybe I'd keep it as a reminder, but not a reminder of him. A reminder of me. Of the version of me that believed in promises made in candlelight without paperwork to back them up. The version that mistook performance for protection. The version that didn't know love, real love, doesn't hide behind legal loopholes. Mara asked me once, "Do you regret it all?" I didn't answer right away. Because it's complicated, isn't it? I don't regret loving. I don't regret building. I don't regret the laughter, the trips, the nights spent dancing in the kitchen. What I regret is how little I asked for, how much I accepted, how I let a ring convince me I was safe when I was actually standing on sand. One morning, I met a woman named Helen at a community class I was taking on small business bookkeeping. We paired up for a budgeting exercise, and over coffee afterward swapped pieces of our stories. She told me she left her husband after 27 years. He was nice, she said, but he never really saw me. Not once. I nodded. Mine saw me. Just not as a partner. More like an accessory. We laughed, two strangers with matching scars. Then she said something that stuck with me. When I took my ring off, I felt naked. But later I realized that wasn't nakedness. That was freedom. Yes, that's exactly what it was. I started wearing a new ring on my right hand. Not an expensive one, just a slim silver band I bought from a woman at the farmer's market who hammered it by hand. It didn't mean anything to anyone else, but to me it meant I choose me now. It was strange at first, the muscle memory of glancing at my left hand and seeing it bare. The phantom weight of 20 years still tugging at my finger. But day by day that finger grew lighter. And so did I. I didn't announce the ring's absence to anyone. People noticed, of course. Some asked, most didn't. But the woman at the post office who'd seen Mark and me come in together for years gave me a long look one day and finally said, "He hasn't been around lately." I just nodded. She leaned in, voice soft. "You look better, though." And for the first time in months, I believed her. Because the mirror no longer showed someone surviving. It showed someone rebuilding. There was one last thing I had to do. I opened the cedar box that held all our photos, the wedding album, the vacations, the Christmases with matching sweaters. I didn't burn them. I didn't shred them. I selected a few that still made me smile, real smiles, not the curated ones, and put them in a separate envelope labeled History. The rest? I packed into a storage bin, labeled it simply Mark Archive. Not memories, not marriage, just archive, because that's what the ring had become. A footnote in a life that had finally begun to be mine. I never hated him. That might surprise some people. But hate is too heavy. It requires energy I no longer wanted to give him. What I felt was something colder, cleaner, closure. The ring had been a prop, but I was the story. And that story wasn't over yet. What I found in his safe. It started with a final visit to the house. The official ruling from the court had come through partial restitution, a financial settlement, and access to retrieve personal belongings from what was once our shared home. Clara had arranged it all through legal channels to keep things clean. I was grateful for that. Grateful not to have to negotiate with Mark face to face. Grateful that the law now recognized, even in its limited language, that I had been more than a ghost in his life. But walking through the front door still felt like stepping into someone else's life. The home I had curated down to the embroidered pillows now smelled sterile, like lemon-scented cleaner and something else. Absence. I moved quickly, collecting what I needed. Books, jewelry, photo albums, my mother's quilt. I didn't linger until I remembered the safe. Mark had kept it tucked in the floor of our bedroom closet. A simple black lockbox with a combination only he knew. He claimed it was for documents and security. Over the years, I'd asked once or twice what was inside. Just boring stuff, he always said. You don't want to dig through tax returns and warranties. I'd trusted that. Now I didn't. I found the safe right where it had always been, under the false floorboard behind a loose pair of shoes he never wore. The temptation was immediate. I almost turned away. Almost told myself, leave it alone. The past is done. What could possibly be worth reopening the wound? But then I remembered Clara's voice from our strategy meeting. If he's hidden anything, especially documentation of assets, you need to find it before he erases the trail. So I called Mara. Do I open it? I asked. There was a pause on the line. Evie, she said. If you don't, it'll haunt you. It took 10 minutes to guess the combination. 10 minutes of trying birth dates, anniversaries, addresses. In the end, it was his mother's birthday. I should have known. Inside, I found 6 manila folders, a velvet bag, a flash drive, and a leather-bound notebook. No weapons, no cash stacks, no diamonds. Just paper. But paper can hold power and secrets sharper than any blade. Hey. The first folder was labeled Grayson Properties, LLC. I opened it to find deed copies, transfer receipts, and rental income statements for 2 properties I had never even heard about, one in Charleston, one in Savannah. Both acquired in the last 5 years. Both purchased under a business entity. Both completely hidden from me. The next folder, Tax Strategy 2014-2020. It was a blueprint of asset shielding, income dispersal, and expense masking, so carefully designed I could only stare in disbelief. He hadn't just left me out of the legal marriage. He had architected an entire life in parallel one, where he could disappear without owing me a dime. And if I hadn't gone to court, if I hadn't hired Clara, he would have succeeded. The third folder made my breath stop cold. It was labeled Correspondence Elena. At first I didn't recognize the name, but then I saw the photos. Mark with a woman, tall, dark-haired, mid-40s, at a marina, at a beach house, at what looked like a family barbecue. And there was more. Printed emails, plane tickets, a hotel reservation in Asheville for 2, dated 5 years ago. A card handwritten tucked into the folder. Thank you for not making promises you don't mean. I love our little corner of the world. E. I sat on the floor, hands shaking. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a life he chose to build elsewhere while keeping me anchored to a false version of one. I opened the velvet bag. Inside jewelry. A diamond tennis bracelet I'd never seen. A gold locket with the initials EL on the back. More evidence of the double life. More proof that love to Mark had always been a matter of distribution, not devotion. Then came the flash drive. I almost didn't look, but I had to know. What else had he buried in silence? I plugged it into my laptop later that night, heart pounding like a war drum. Inside folders, documents, spreadsheets, photos. But one folder was labeled Plan B. Inside it, a full relocation strategy. Offshore banking contacts. A Costa Rica property search. A list of legal contacts for setting up residency outside the U.S. And a note to self. If Evie ever gets suspicious, move sooner. She's good, but she trusts too easily. I stared at the screen, mouth dry. He had predicted me. Built a backup escape plan in case I woke up. This wasn't just betrayal. This was premeditated erasure. The final item was the leather notebook. Not a journal, not exactly. It was filled with handwritten lists, budgets, tasks, memories, and a page titled What Evelyn Doesn't Know. There were 12 bullet points, each one a confession in shorthand. I read them slowly, each one cracking something deeper than the last. 2005, didn't file taxes jointly? Told her I did. 2009, pulled money from joint savings to invest privately. 2012, told her I canceled the boat lease. Didn't. 2017, registered Savannah rental under sister's name. 2020, kept inheritance from dad separate, $212K. And finally, 2023, knew she'd never check, but she's getting smarter. That one undid me. Because it was true. I had gotten smarter. Too late to stop the damage. But not too late to walk away with the whole damn file. I left the safe open. I left the folders on the bed. And I left a sticky note, just 4 words. I know, it's over. Then I walked out of the house, not like a woman broken, but like a woman documented. Because now I had proof, not just for court, for myself, that I hadn't imagined it, that I hadn't exaggerated it. Back at the cottage, I scanned every file. I sent it all to Clara. We amended our motion. Mark's financial manipulation, previously speculative, now had timestamps and receipts. She called it civil fraud, by omission. She also said, Evie, this may change everything, but I already knew that, because what I found in that safe, it wasn't just evidence. It was closure bound in betrayal, yes, but powerful, because I was no longer the woman wondering what went wrong. I was the woman who saw. And when you see clearly, you don't go back. You walk forward with fire in your chest and your name finally back in your hands. My son wanted me to forgive him. It was my son Aaron who knocked on the door of the cottage 2 days after I discovered Mark's safe. Not a call, not a warning. Just 3 firm knocks, the kind that echoed off the porch rails and into my chest like a memory I wasn't ready to unpack. I opened the door slowly. He stood there in jeans and a hoodie, eyes rimmed with fatigue, hands in his pockets like a boy again. But he wasn't a boy anymore. He was 22, tall like his father, quiet like me. And in that moment, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Mom, he said barely above a whisper. Come in, I said, stepping aside. He didn't. Not right away. Instead, he looked over my shoulder into the cozy little room I'd created for myself, and his jaw clenched. I didn't know, he said. I nodded. I know. No, he said firmer. I really didn't know. We sat on the porch. He refused tea but held the warm mug I made anyway. The wind off the lake danced through the pines, and for a moment I imagined we were just mother and son again, talking about college, the weather, the cat we never got. But it didn't last. I found out about the properties last year, he said, eyes fixed on the mug. The ones in South Carolina. Dad told me they were business only. He said you knew. And you believed him, I said gently. He nodded. There was no defense in his posture, no deflection, just shame. I thought, If you didn't talk about it, it must have been one of those grown-up marriage things. You always said you trusted him. I exhaled slowly. I did. That was the problem. Aaron had always admired his father, worshipped him even. Mark was the man who coached his soccer games, who taught him how to parallel park, who gave him his first bottle of aftershave and said, "You're a man now." And I had let that illusion live. I had fed it, even telling Aaron his father worked hard, that he loved us, that marriage was complicated but worth it. I didn't do it to lie. I did it to protect him. But now I saw how protection, when misplaced, becomes just another kind of betrayal. "He asked me not to come see you," Aaron said quietly. "After court." I turned to him. "What?" He said. "You were emotional. That this was about money. That if I got involved, it would mess up the legal stuff." I stared at him. My son. The boy I had held through fevers, who I taught to read, who I watched graduate in the front row with tears in my eyes. And now he was telling me his father had tried to erase me from his life too. I didn't believe him, Aaron added quickly. "Not really. But I didn't come. And that's on me." I looked at him, really looked. He was too young to carry this. But he needed to. So I said it plainly. "Your father lied to me for 20 years. About our marriage. Our money. Our life." Aaron's jaw clenched. I found documents, proof, hidden accounts, a second relationship. His face paled. "I went to court not just to get what I was owed, but to make it real. Because for 20 years I thought I was your father's wife. And I wasn't." He blinked slowly. "I want to believe you didn't know. And I do. But I need you to understand, this wasn't just some adult disagreement. This was a life built on sand. And when the tide came in, I was the only one left drowning." He didn't speak for a long time. Then he whispered, I feel like everything I knew just cracked in half. "Welcome to the club," I said with a bitter smile. We sat in silence after that, the kind that doesn't rush to fill itself, the kind that lets grief stretch its arms and settle. Finally, he asked, "Do you hate him?" I looked out at the trees. "No," I said. "I don't hate him. But I see him now. And once you see, you can't unsee." He nodded. Then carefully, like the words were glass, "Can I still love him?" That one cut deep, because the mother in me wanted to say yes. To protect him again, to shield him from the truth's sharp edges. But the woman in me, the woman who had finally stopped erasing herself, knew better. "You can love him," I said. "But don't lie for him. Not even in your own mind." He cried then, quietly. A single tear wiped away fast. I didn't reach for him. I let him cry. Because some truths have to land without comfort. Some truths need to ache. But after a minute he reached for my hand, and I held it. Not like a mother rescuing her son, but like a woman letting someone meet her in the wreckage, not as a child, but as a witness. Before he left, he asked me something I didn't expect. "Can I stay here for a few days?" I blinked. "Here, just to get my head straight." I hesitated. Not because I didn't want him, but because I wasn't sure who I was with him anymore. The mother who made pancakes on Sundays, or the woman rebuilding alone. But then I saw the bags under his eyes. The way he hadn't asked for anything but space. And I nodded. Of course. That night we sat on the couch and watched a terrible movie. We ate takeout. We talked about nothing. And in the quiet between scenes, he looked over and said, "I'm sorry it took me so long to come." I looked at him, my son, my blood, my one undeniable truth. "You came," I said. "That's what matters." And I meant it, because sometimes the apology isn't in the words. It's in the knock at the door, and the courage to face the truth, even when it fractures everything you thought was solid. The letter I never sent him until now. The letter began long before I ever wrote a word. It began in those first sleepless nights after I found out the truth, when I paced the cottage barefoot with my robe tied too tight, whispering sentences into the dark that I wished I could shove down his throat. It began the day I stood in the DMV and wrote my name as Evelyn Hart for the first time in 20 years, hands trembling like they belonged to someone else. It began the moment I opened his safe. But I didn't start writing it until after Aaron left. After he hugged me goodbye, after he cried for the version of his father he'd believed in, after he promised to come back next week. Not because I asked, but because he wanted to. And when the screen door shut behind him and the lake air rushed into the empty space, I sat down at the old wooden table and wrote the words I'd been holding like coals inside my chest. The letter I never thought he deserved, but I now realized I needed to write. Mark, I began. No, dear. Just his name. Because this wasn't a love letter. It was a reckoning. Mark, I'm not writing this for closure. I already found that in a courtroom, in a safe, in the silence after you left. I'm writing this because there are things I need to say on the record, not in court documents, but in the space between two people who once believed they were building a life together. I want you to know that I loved you, not in the fairy tale sense, in the real, aching, deeply inconvenient way that love actually works. I loved you when you failed. I loved you when you sulked. I loved you when you forgot birthdays and came home late and told me next year we'll finally go to Paris. I loved you when I thought love was enough. But I see now that love, real love, isn't about just staying. It's about being accountable. It's about showing up with your name on the lease, your truth on the table, your hands open instead of closed around secrets. And you couldn't do that. You made me your home and never gave me the keys. I paused, my breath catching on that last line. Because it was true. I had been his home, the place he came to rest, to be comforted, to be seen. But he had always kept one foot near the door. And now he was on the other side of it. You told me you forgot to file the license. You said it was just a mistake. But Mark, I saw your plan B. I read your lists. I saw the safe. I know. You planned for my doubt. You strategized for my awakening. You expected me to look the other way. And that's where you were wrong. I may have been slow to see, but I'm not blind anymore. And I will never be invisible again. Tears didn't come. Not anymore. I was too far past the storm. What I felt now was power, not rage, but clarity. That rare, sharp kind of peace that arrives when the fog finally burns off and you see the landscape for what it is, scorched perhaps, but yours again. I don't hate you. That would mean I still carry you. What I feel now is distance and relief. Because in losing the illusion of you, I found the truth of me. You once said I was the glue that held our life together. But glue dries, it cracks, and eventually, it lets go. You were never a husband. You were a performance. And I spent too many years applauding a script I didn't realize was fiction. But I've left the theater now. The curtains have closed. And I am walking into a new story, one I write alone. You will not be in the next chapter. Goodbye, Evelyn. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into a plain white envelope, and sealed it. I didn't mail it. I never intended to. Instead, I walked out to the lake, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting a golden shimmer across the surface. I held the envelope in my hand. Then I set it on fire. The flame took fast, a bright, hungry bloom of orange and gold that curled the edges in seconds. I watched it burn until the last blackened scrap floated away on the wind. And then I stood there, alone, whole, unburdened. Back inside the cottage was quiet, peaceful. I lit a candle. I poured myself a glass of wine. And I wrote the first line of a new journal, one I'd bought just for this next part of the journey. Today I chose not to forgive him, but to forgive myself for trusting him. And that was more than enough. I finally told the truth at the reunion. It was Mara who convinced me to go. The 25th anniversary of our college graduation was being held at a winery 2 towns over, and I had ignored the invitation for weeks. The thought of walking into a room filled with smiling couples and small talk about vacation homes and grandkids made my stomach twist. But Mara didn't let up. You don't go for them, she said. You go for you. To be seen. Not as Mark's wife. Not as the woman who vanished. As you, Evelyn. Her voice cracked when she said it. And maybe that's what did it. So I bought a dress, soft sage, not too flashy but elegant, and booked a trim at the local salon. Not for anyone else. For me. For the woman who had stopped shrinking into her chair. That night, as I zipped up the dress and looked at myself in the mirror, I whispered aloud, "You're going to tell the truth. Not for revenge, but because the story belonged to me now." The winery was everything you'd expect: glass chandeliers, white tablecloths, music that hovered like perfume, name tags with our graduation photos, clusters of people caught in memories they hadn't visited in years. I walked in alone, heads turned. Some recognized me immediately, others took longer, but there was no pity in their eyes, just curiosity. And something else, a quiet respect. Mara greeted me with a squeal and a bear hug, then promptly announced to the group near the bar, "She's here, the real Evelyn." They laughed, but they didn't understand. Not yet. It didn't take long for Mark's name to come up. We had gone to college together, that's where we met. Our wedding had even been mentioned in the alumni newsletter back in the day. People remembered us as a power couple. I was talking with a few old classmates when Karen, a woman I'd shared a dorm suite with, said, "So how's Mark doing? I heard he opened a second office in Savannah." There it was. The moment. I could have smiled and deflected. I could have nodded and lied. Instead, I took a breath deep even and said, "Mark and I were never legally married. He never filed the papers." A stunned silence. I let it sit. Then calmly I found out after 20 years. I took him to court. He had other properties, hidden finances, even another woman. I left. I live alone now. And I'm doing better than I've ever been. The silence shifted. Not into judgment, but into awe. And then Karen reached out and touched my arm. "Evelyn," she whispered, "that's incredible. I'm so sorry. And so proud of you." Someone poured me another glass of wine. Someone else said you should write a book. And just like that, I realized, telling the truth doesn't shrink you. It sets you free. Later that night, after the dinner and speeches, the dancing began. I was sitting near the back watching the swirl of satin and sequins when a man I hadn't spoken to since senior year approached me. His name was Daniel. He'd been in our economics class, tall, thoughtful, quiet. Always had a kind word even back then. "I heard what you said," he said softly, taking the seat next to me. I smiled. I didn't mean to make a scene. He chuckled. "It wasn't a scene. It was a statement." I sipped my wine. It felt necessary. "I'm glad you did it." A pause. Then he said, "You look like someone who finally walked out of a storm." I turned to him, and I smiled. "Funny," I said. "That's exactly how it feels." Daniel and I danced once. Just one slow song beneath the chandeliers, while the past watched quietly from the corners of the room. He didn't ask for my number. He didn't ask about Mark. He just said, "If you ever want to have coffee and not talk about the past, I'd like that." And I said, "Maybe I will." Not because I needed to be rescued, but because for the first time I felt like someone who didn't need rescuing. Just a little light and a place to stand. I left the reunion at midnight. As I drove home along the winding roads, the moon rising like a lantern in the sky, I realized what had shifted. For years I had avoided telling people the truth because I thought it would make them see me as less than. But tonight I saw something else. The truth didn't diminish me. It restored me. Piece by piece, word by word. When I got home, I took off my shoes, stood barefoot in the garden, and tilted my face to the stars. Then I whispered just loud enough for the night to hear, "I am not your wife. I never was. But I am me. And that is finally enough." The day the other woman showed up. She showed up just after noon on a Tuesday. I had just finished watering the potted herbs on the porch and was carrying the empty watering can inside when I saw her tall, dark-haired and standing stiffly at the bottom of the front steps, as if unsure whether to knock or run away. She looked exactly like her photos. I didn't need her to introduce herself. This was Elena, the woman from the beach photos, the name on the love notes tucked in Mark's hidden files. The other life. The woman I should have hated. And yet all I felt was a strange stillness, as if time folded in on itself and placed us side by side, not as enemies, but as two casualties of the same architect. She cleared her throat. "Evelyn." Her voice trembled just slightly. I nodded. Yes, I'm sorry. I. She glanced down, clutching her purse like a lifeline. I know I shouldn't be here. But I didn't know where else to go. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I opened the screen door and said, "You'd better come in." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one I'd written that letter to Mark at, the same one I'd eaten alone at every night for weeks. Now across from me sat the woman he'd shared years of secrets with. Elena looked around slowly. "It's peaceful here." "Thank you," I said. She looked down at her hands. No ring, no jewelry at all. "I didn't come to explain myself," she said quickly. "I just needed to hear from someone who actually knew him." I raised an eyebrow. "You didn't." She smiled, bitter and brief. "I thought I did. But the truth is, I only ever knew the version he gave me." She pulled a small photo from her purse and placed it on the table. A boy, maybe 7. Dark eyes. Mark's chin. "My son," she said. "Leo." My mouth went dry. Mark had a child. Not just a mistress. A family. I stared at the picture, blinking slowly. She seemed to read my silence. "You didn't know?" It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "I didn't." "I thought you were the ex-wife," she whispered. "That it was all over. That you two had split a long time ago." That's what he told me when we met. I looked at her, trying to read the sincerity in her eyes. She wasn't lying. She looked like someone who had just escaped the same fog I'd been trapped in. "Did you ever ask about me?" I asked quietly. She flinched. "Once. Maybe twice." He always changed the subject. Said it was complicated. That you were bitter. Controlling. He said you wouldn't sign the divorce papers, that you wanted to ruin him. I laughed, bitter and soft. "That's rich," I said. "We were never legally married. He never filed the license." Her face froze. Then she whispered, "He told me he divorced you in 2011. I shook my head slowly. That would have been difficult, since no such marriage existed. We sat in silence for a long time. She looked down at her hands again. "I gave him 10 years," she said. "I gave him a child. I thought we were building something. I thought I was the woman he finally chose." I nodded slowly. So did I. The air between us was thick with sorrow, but also understanding. A strange, painful sisterhood. We had both been conned, fed different stories, used for different seasons, but discarded just the same. "I found out about you when Leo found a letter addressed to Mark and Evelyn Hart," she said. "It was from his old law firm. He kept it in a drawer." I winced. "That's when I started digging." She met my eyes, tears brimming. "I didn't come here for forgiveness. I thought you should know. That you're not the only one." Her voice cracked. "That he lied to both of us." I nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me," I said. We sat in the quiet, broken only by the soft tick of the kitchen clock. Then I asked her the question I'd been holding in my throat. "Do you still love him?" She looked at me, startled. Then she said no. She paused, then added, "I grieve him, but I don't love him. I think I loved who I thought he was. And now, I don't know what that means." I reached for her hand across the table, not out of sympathy, but solidarity. "I know exactly what you mean." Before she left, she pulled something else from her purse. A folded envelope. "I found this," she said, "a few months ago. It's addressed to you." I don't think he ever intended to send it. I took the envelope, heart hammering. "I couldn't open it," she added. "It didn't feel right." I nodded. "Thank you," I said. She walked to the door, paused, turned. "Whatever he did," she said, "you came out stronger." I smiled, for real this time. "So did you." And then she was gone. I waited a long time before opening the letter. It sat on the table for hours. Eventually, curiosity won. It was handwritten. Short. Simple. "Evelyn, I know you'll find everything. I've always known. I did love you once. Maybe I always will. But I didn't know how to stay honest. I never did. I hope someday you'll be happy. Mark." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't nothing. I folded it carefully, placed it beside the ashes of my own letter to him, the one I had burned. And then I poured a cup of tea, sat on my porch, and whispered into the air, "I'm already happy." Because I was And I didn't need Mark or his lies, or even his regret to define that anymore. I was never his wife. But now, I'm fully myself. The day I received the final court notice, the one that closed the last file, the one that affirmed on paper that my name was no longer tied in any way to Mark's, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't feel rage or relief or the blazing righteousness I thought would come with justice. I felt clean, as if something heavy, something invisible had been scrubbed from my skin. For 20 years I'd called myself a wife, signed Christmas cards as Mrs. Mark Hart, checked boxes that said married, filed taxes as married filing jointly, or so I thought. Held my breath beside him at dinner parties and business events, smiled when he smiled, swallowed silence when he lied. And now the truth was carved into legal stone. I had never been his wife. I had been his cover, his convenience, his decoration, his decoy, but not his wife. Not in the eyes of the law, not in the eyes of love. And now at last I was no longer pretending otherwise. That morning, after the papers were delivered, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the ocean. It was a short drive from the cottage. I packed a blanket, a thermos of tea, a book I had no intention of reading, and a pen. No notebook, just the pen. Because I didn't need to write it all down again. I just needed to carry something that reminded me, you can still make your own mark. The beach was mostly empty, wind-whipped, and wide. I took off my shoes, let the waves curl over my toes, and I whispered aloud, Evelyn Hart, party of one, and smiled. I thought about all the things I'd lost, the anniversaries that were fake, the vows I'd believed in spoken over cake and wine, surrounded by people who, like me, assumed this was real, the vacations I paid for, the nights I waited up alone in our house while Mark said he was stuck at the office or helping his brother, the way I convinced myself it was enough, the way I taught myself that love was patience and endurance, even when I was dying of thirst in a desert I didn't know I'd been banished to. I thought about the things I didn't get, the security, the legal recognition, the shared retirement, the safety net, the truth. But then the tide pulled back, and something inside me lifted, because I realized I had something now that I never had before, myself. Aaron calls more often now. He came over last weekend with groceries and a half-dozen homemade candles. You've got to try eucalyptus, he said, waving a jar like a salesman. We made dinner together. No tension, no awkward silences, just stories and laughter. I told him about the reunion. He told me he's been seeing someone new. Someone calm, he said, laughing. Someone who doesn't play games. I told him he was becoming his own man. He told me I was the strongest woman he'd ever met. We didn't talk about Mark. We didn't need to. We were writing something new. Elena sent a postcard, a photo of her and her son Leo at the zoo. On the back she wrote, "It's strange, isn't it? How we were both versions of the same lie, but now we're free. I hope freedom is treating you well. E." I pinned it to my fridge, because some ghosts deserve to be honored, not buried. I've begun teaching art again. Not full-time, just a small class at the community center. Retired women, single moms, teenagers trying to make sense of heartbreak through brush strokes. We sit in a circle and talk about color and line and texture, but really we're talking about stories. One woman, Diane, painted a tree every week. Different shapes, different sizes. When I asked her why, she said, because I finally stopped being afraid to take up space. I knew exactly what she meant. I changed my last name. Not back to my maiden name that belonged to a girl who hadn't yet been forged in fire. Not to Hart, that name was hollow now, echoing with lies. I chose something new. Evelyn North. Simple, rooted, unclaimed by any man. North because I had found my own direction, and now no one else would chart it for me. I kept the journal, the one I started after I burned the letter to Mark. I fill it slowly. No pressure, no structure. Sometimes just a word, sometimes pages. One entry reads, "Today I took a nap and didn't feel guilty about it." Another says, "I opened all the windows and danced like I was 17. Another, "No more pretending, no more shrinking. I am the author now." They aren't brilliant. They aren't poetry, but they are mine. Unedited, Unapologetic. Alive. Oh, there are still days I ache. When I pass a couple holding hands. When I see a woman wearing a ring and I wonder if it's real, not just the diamond, but the promise. When I see photos from long ago and ask myself, did he love me at all? But those days pass, like clouds over water, and the sun always comes back. Because even if he never loved me, I do, and that is enough. If you've made it this far, dear listener, I want you to hear this part clearly. You can survive the truth, even when it shatters everything, even when it undoes decades, even when it steals your breath. You can survive it, and you can come back brighter. Not because the truth is gentle, but because it finally sets you free. Okay. Mark tried to erase me, legally, emotionally, spiritually, but I am still here. I was never his wife, but now I am wholly mine. And that is the most sacred thing I've ever been. Slow emotional fade out. If you've ever been lied to, if you've ever had to rebuild from the wreckage of love, if you've ever had to reclaim your name, your voice, your truth, know that you are not alone. I was never his wife, but I became a woman no man could disappear. And maybe that's the greatest victory of all.